Life is just one big overcorrection. Now, this comes to us from Morgan Housel in the book Same as Ever. And I highly recommend you read it. Very good book. But the notion that life is just one big overcorrection, I think, is true on the individual and on the global scale. I mean, we we get to a point where it's just we are creatures always trying to improve, always trying to do something a little bit better, always trying to be a little bit more productive, always trying to, be 1% better. We strive for this as a society, I believe. Now, it's clear, obviously, we're not all always consciously, willfully doing this, but there is people pushing the needle on it. And there is people who in their own lives, well, everyone in their own life has an area in which they are at least trying to do this in some way, shape, or form, even if it's pleasure seeking, even if it's, whatever it is. It's always, you know wanting, if it's, pleasure seeking, wanting to get a little bit higher, or if it's, productivity, it's, trying to get a little more output in this amount of time with higher quality work, and so on and so forth. But it's clear that we'll get to a position where we believe that we are now in lack of something. This constantly happens. And this, you cannot be in lack of something and be happy. You cannot be satisfied, fulfilled, if you believe that you are lacking. And that's why the human of the modern age, who has really, most humans don't have to deal with the base of Maslow's hierarchy. We are pretty high up. So this question comes often, what is it that we are lacking? And what is preventing me from being happier? And when we figure out what that is, an overcorrection ensues. If we have, been working for very hard for a year and we've been not hanging out with friends, not seeing people, then we'll feel, like we don't want solitude anymore. And we want to hang out with people. And we feel like, oh, that's the reason I've been, kind of down lately. And we'll overcorrect. We'll start trying to hang out with people too often. We won't be saying no. We won't, we'll, every opportunity we have, we'll go into it. And then we'll get to a point where we know we shouldn't anymore, but we'll have FOMO. We'll be like, oh, but, wasn't I supposed to hang out with these people? Wasn't I supposed to stop being in solitude so much and stop doing so much work and stop doing these things alone that I really enjoy doing, and start sacrificing and start hanging out with people, and we'll do an overcorrection and we'll do too much of it. And then we'll get to a point where we realize, this has been so destructive. I'm no longer pushing the needle where I was. I'm no longer doing the things I like to do. I'm just hanging out with these people and we're not really doing the things I want to do. And you'll overcorrect again, but you'll go back to not seeing anybody. You'll go back to having no contact with people. And it's just, and then, it'll happen again, and it'll just be a series of overcorrections to overcorrection, one way or the other. And, this clearly happens on, I think it's clear it's happening in this day and age right now with the World War II narrative that is falling apart. That the notion that Hitler is the worst person to ever exist is falling apart. And I'm not saying that Hitler is a good person, but I am saying that he became to humanity what Voldemort is in Harry Potter. When you say Hitler, you lower your voice. You don't want to be sound too loud, even if you're talking negative about him. You don't want it to, you don't just scream Hitler. You don't just scream Nazis. And it's clear that we are in the middle of an overcorrection on the World War II narrative, because we overcorrected. And I'm not, this is, like I said, this isn't a video to, proclaim Hitler or anything of that nature. But to me, I think it's interesting that we joined with Stalin, we joined with communism to defeat Hitler. And, communism it's been rife. I don't know if rife's the right word, but it's been in the colleges forever in America, and it's accepted because we joined with Stalin. Obviously not strictly for that reason, but fascism died because the victors write history, and we wrote fascism off. I think to a certain degree, we wrote fascism off to be the worst thing ever. Even though communism, I think, has killed more people than fascism has killed. If you think about the the gulags, if you think about China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, all these places where communism came up in and genocides were committed, just as fascism did. But you can say that you are a communist, and it has a different taste than saying that you are a fascist or that you are a Nazi. And I think that narrative is falling apart because people are now seeing how messed up Stalin was and how we joined in evil. And to justify our evils, it seemed like we didn't want to point the finger to the evil. And then we essentially gave Europe over to Stalin, and more atrocities were committed, you know. And the whole point of this, because the whole point is just that we're basically, I think, in an overcorrection now. We're in an overcorrection of people now being annoyed with the fact that there was some propaganda, some lying, and they are overcorrecting the other way now and saying now that, you know, we teamed up with the wrong people, that we fought the wrong evil. And I think we are in a state of an overcorrection in that sense. But I don't want to focus too much on that because I'm not very well versed in that area. But I think you're a fool if you can't see that we are in the midst of an overcorrection in that nature, and that is due to the overcorrection that happened in the past to try to justify us teaming up with Russia, to try to justify communism. And we did that knowing full well that the Cold War, whatever, we didn't know it would be called the Cold War, but we knew what the Cold War was going to happen. And we just, we put the veil over our eyes in that sense and said, we'll deal with it when that time comes. And I think that's just how life goes. And I think it's human nature to just overcorrect and overcorrect. It's just overcorrection after overcorrection on the individual level. And then that's just where I see it in society nowadays. I watched a great video by Jonathan Pageau talking about the World War II narrative falling apart. And it is clearly falling apart. And when a narrative falls apart, when you realize you're lacking, you go to an overcorrection. It doesn't mean that a correction is not needed, because typically there is a correction needed. Typically there is something that needs to be confronted. But it's just human nature to just overcorrect, to just go all out, to just, say we are in immense lack of this thing, and then to go too far. I think you see it too. I don't know, I'm not completely well versed in political and social issues of our day, which maybe I should be more, but um, I like to focus on the micro, on the individual level. But I think you see that in the same thing with feminism. It was obviously wrong that women weren't allowed to vote, and that caused a massive overcorrection into now, men being devils and women thinking that they can run the world much better on their own. And we're just in a deep overcorrection in that area. And it's going to overcorrect the other way, unfortunately. But that's just how human nature is. That's just how it is. That's just how it goes. And the awareness of this, I believe, is valuable. And that's all we can truly have, because you can't stop human nature. There's a good line, I don't remember who said it, but it isn't that history repeats itself, but human nature repeats itself. And I think that's so true. And obviously history repeats itself because human nature repeats itself. But history is like a branch. The root of the tree is human nature, of these things that just don't change. Of, it's my, like it says in Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun because human nature is not changing. It changes maybe minor, little differences, but in the grand scope of human nature, it's still very much the same. And it takes root in different areas and different technological advances, but the same thing, at its roots, the same reasons, the same causes for these things coming to surface are the same things. And I don't want this video to be, this video isn't supposed to be about an external world overcorrection, but more of an internal world, I guess external, but not about society, but about more the individual, how in ourselves it's clear that we overcorrect because we see a lack. I'm lacking this, so I overcorrect. And then you get to a position after a certain amount of time where you now think the opposite. I once was lacking this due to an excess of this, but I am now lacking this due to an excess of this. And we just can't find the middle. If you could find the middle, we would be perfect. But we can't find the middle. We are like on a pendulum of back and forth and back and forth. And then, maybe over time we slowly shrink that pendulum. It's no longer this big, it's, this big, and our overcorrections are smaller. And, maybe we lean more one side to the other because one side is more virtuous than the other. That's, Aristotle's whole point in Nicomachean Ethics, where virtue is the mean of two excesses. Courage courage is rashness and cowardice. And, in that sense, if you think about it, overcorrecting, we can shrink that pendulum. But Aristotle would say it's better to be rash than a coward. So you might lean a little bit more to being rash. You might default to being rash instead of being a coward. And I don't disagree. And through Aristotle's understanding, that would be the better course of action because one is better than the other. They both are bad, but one excess is better than the other. And to be rash is better than to be a coward. And I would have to agree. And as I said, I don't think we can stop overcorrections, but the awareness of the overcorrection can bring the pendulum down. It can bring awareness to the fact that what we are doing, and it can make us more understanding of other people who are in the midst of an overcorrection. And we can bring to their attention that they are potentially in an overcorrection. And if they are rational human beings, maybe they unbiasedly, as much as a human can look at that overcorrection and say, you're right. It was messed up, and this was messed up, but to overcorrect the complete opposite way is also messed up. I shouldn't go that far. And maybe it's like one of those things where it's just, I don't know what you would call it, but it's like, the physics thing. Like, you drop this thing right here and it goes this way, and as it comes back, it won't go the same height again. And maybe that's just what we have to do with our own life. And potentially it just gets to a point, and maybe that's why people think when you get older, you get wiser, because you're no longer teetering so much to one side or the other. You get closer to moderation. You get further away from excess in any given area. And obviously that doesn't automatically come with age, but I could see it, I think, because we definitely can, reset the height, but with age, maybe you have more time to let it relax, and you have more understanding that you should let it relax and avoid the overcorrections as much as possible.